The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl pull a rusted box from a drain, and the secret inside should have stayed buried. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. The sun was setting over the small town of Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The air was crisp, the smell of pine trees mixed with the faint scent of motor oil, a smell that Jake Morrison, a member of the Hells Angels, was all too familiar with. He had been riding through the town for hours, seeking solace on his motorcycle after a long day. As he turned the corner, he slowed his bike when he noticed a little girl standing near a storm drain. Her small frame was hunched over, struggling to pull something from the muck. At first, Jake thought nothing of it. Kids often played near the drains, and it wasn't unusual to see someone scavenging through the city's forgotten corners. But then something caught his eye. The object the girl was pulling out was a box, old and rusted, barely visible beneath the pile of leaves and debris. Curiosity piqued. Jake parked his bike a few yards away, deciding to watch from a distance. The girl was about 6 or 7, with dark hair tangled in messy braids. She wore a faded jacket that was too big for her small frame, and her shoes were caked with mud from the rain earlier in the day. As she finally freed the box, she stumbled back, clutching it in her hands. She seemed unsure of what to do next, glancing around nervously before glancing down at the object in her hands. Jake's instincts told him something was off. He had seen enough in his time to know when something was out of place. The girl's hesitation, the way she clutched the box as though it were a secret she wasn't meant to reveal, set off alarms in his mind. Without thinking, Jake walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath his feet. The girl looked up, startled by his presence. She froze, her wide eyes locking onto his leather vest and the Hells Angels patch on his back. Jake knelt down to her level, trying to seem less intimidating despite the tattoos that covered his arms and the rough exterior he had earned over the years. "Hey there," he said softly. "What's in the box?" The girl didn't respond right away. She looked down at the box in her hands, her lips trembling. I found it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it's not mine." "It's okay," Jake reassured her, his voice gentle. "What's inside?" The girl hesitated, as if considering whether or not to trust him. After a long pause, she slowly opened the rusty lid. Inside were a few old photographs and several crumpled pieces of paper. But one item caught Jake's eye, an old, weathered letter, its edges frayed and stained with age. It looked like it had been hidden away for decades. He reached for it, his curiosity growing. As soon as his fingers brushed the letter, a sense of unease washed over him. This was no ordinary find. He could feel it. The letter was important. The girl quickly closed the box, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't think I'm supposed to have this," she said, her voice trembling. Jake's heart skipped a beat. There was more to this than just a child's curiosity. What had she found? And why did she seem so frightened? He needed answers. But something told him this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he could have ever expected. Jake stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the girl as she clutched the box to her chest. He could tell something was off, and his gut told him this wasn't just a random find. The letter inside, the fear in the girl's eyes, all of it screamed that there was more to the story. He glanced at the box one more time before looking back at her. "You didn't answer me," he said gently. "What's inside the box, really?" The girl hesitated again, her small hands shaking as she held the box tightly. For a moment, Jake wondered if she would run away. But instead, she seemed to relax, a decision flickering in her eyes. It's a letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A letter from my grandpa." Jake nodded slowly, keeping his voice calm. He could feel the weight of the moment settling in. "Can I see it?" The girl nodded, then hesitated for a split second before opening the box again. She pulled out the crumpled letter, its edges torn and stained. "It's not for me," she said. "My grandpa told me it was for someone else, someone who's long gone. He said it was a secret that should stay buried, but I didn't know what he meant." The words sent a chill down Jake's spine. His instincts told him this wasn't just about an old letter or some family history. There was something deeper, Something dangerous. Who did he say the letter was for? Jake asked, crouching down to her level. The girl swallowed hard, then looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. I don't know, she said quietly. He wouldn't tell me. But he said that if anyone ever found it, it would be trouble. Jake stood up again, the wheels in his mind already turning. He had a bad feeling about this, and his life in the Hells Angels had taught him to trust his gut. He was about to say something when a distant noise interrupted him, a low, rumbling sound, like the growl of a motorcycle engine. His eyes narrowed as he turned toward the street. It wasn't just any bike. This one had a distinctive roar, a sound he recognized instantly. His body tensed. Hells Angels. A group of them. His instincts went into overdrive. Jake's hand instinctively went to the knife hidden under his leather vest. He turned back to the girl. You need to go inside, he said quickly. Now. The girl looked confused but didn't question him. She ran toward the front door, leaving Jake standing in the street, watching the approaching bikes. The roar grew louder, and soon the first of the riders appeared at the end of the street. They weren't slowing down. Jake could feel the tension building, his heart pounding in his chest. This was bad. Very bad. As the bikers neared, Jake's worst fears were confirmed. They weren't just passing through. They were headed straight for the house. His eyes quickly scanned the area. There were no cops around, no witnesses. This was happening now. Without thinking, Jake reached for the box the girl had left behind, tucking it into his jacket before heading toward the front door. As he reached for the door handle, the bikers pulled up to the curb. One of them, a tall man with a heavy build and a long scar running down his cheek, dismounted and walked toward Jake with a purposeful stride. We need to talk, the man said, his voice rough, carrying the authority of someone used to giving orders. Jake didn't move, his eyes locked on the man's, sizing him up. This wasn't just a casual meeting. This was about something bigger. About what? Jake asked, keeping his voice steady, though inside, his heart was racing. The man smirked, taking a slow step forward. You know exactly what this is about, he said, his eyes scanning Jake's leather jacket, then flicking toward the door where the little girl had disappeared. Jake's mind raced. He had to protect her, but he knew that if he didn't play his cards right, it could end badly for both of them. He made a quick decision. I don't know what you're talking about, Jake said, his voice low but firm. But if you want to talk, we can do it on my terms. The man's smile faded. You think you can handle this? He asked, taking another step forward. Jake didn't back down. I'm not afraid of you, he said, his tone icy. But if you're here to cause trouble, I'll make sure you regret it. The man paused, studying Jake carefully. For a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then, without a word, the man turned and signaled for the others to follow him. This isn't over, he said, his voice cold, before walking back toward the motorcycles. Jake stood frozen, watching them disappear into the distance. His heart was still pounding in his chest. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. He looked at the front door where the little girl had disappeared, then back at the box hidden in his jacket. He had to protect her, whatever it took. But he didn't know if he was ready for what was about to come. The letter wasn't just a secret, it was a warning. The next morning, Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the empty street. The night before had been a warning, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. The bikers had left, but their presence lingered in the air, like a storm waiting to break. His hand gripped the box the girl had left behind, the letter inside pressing against his chest. He needed to know what was in that letter, but at the same time, he was afraid of what he might uncover. The girl had disappeared into the house with her grandmother, but Jake knew they weren't safe. Not anymore. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to see the girl, Emma, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with curiosity. Are you okay? She asked, her voice soft but laced with concern. Jake smiled faintly, trying to reassure her. I'm fine, kid. Just trying to figure things out. Emma stepped into the room, her small hands clutching her jacket tightly. You didn't tell me last night, she said, her voice trembling slightly. What's in the box? Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. He wasn't sure he could trust her with everything yet, but he knew she deserved to know something. It's a letter, he said, slowly walking over to the table. A letter from your grandfather. Emma's eyes widened, and she stepped closer. My grandpa, she repeated, her voice filled with a mix of confusion and hope. Why did he leave it for me? Jake shook his head, his mind racing. I don't know, Emma, but I think it's important. Something bad is going to happen if we don't figure it out. Emma looked at him, her face serious for a moment before she spoke again. What if it's a secret? Like, something we shouldn't know? Jake's heart skipped a beat. The girl was smarter than he gave her credit for. Exactly, he said, his voice low. That's why we need to be careful. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Jake's hand instinctively went to the knife he always kept tucked into his jacket. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his instincts told him this wasn't a social visit. He walked cautiously to the door and peeked through the crack. To his surprise, it was Mrs. Richardson, the grandmother. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling. Is everything okay? Jake asked, opening the door wider. Mrs. Richardson stepped inside, her eyes flicking nervously to Emma. I think we need to talk, she said, her voice shaking. Jake gestured for her to sit down, and she did so, her hands folded tightly in her lap. What's going on? Jake asked, his tone softer now. Mrs. Richardson took a deep breath before speaking. Last night, she began. After you left, I went through some of my old things. Things I should have thrown away a long time ago. She paused, looking at Emma. I found a letter too, one that your grandfather wrote to me years ago. But it wasn't just any letter, Jake. It was a warning. He knew something was coming, something big. And he said that if anyone ever found that box, it would mean trouble. Jake's heart raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make sense. Trouble? He asked, his voice low. Mrs. Richardson nodded. Yes. He said that the secret in the box would bring a storm, and that we weren't to tell anyone about it. But after last night, I don't know what to think anymore. The letter was meant for you, Jake. Jake stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she had just said. For me? He asked, his mind reeling. Mrs. Richardson nodded again. He knew that you'd be the one to find it. He trusted you, Jake. But he didn't want you to get involved. He said it would ruin everything. Jake's head was spinning. He had always known that his past with the Hells Angels had a dark side, but he never thought it would come back to haunt him like this. He looked down at the box in his hands, then at Emma, who was now staring at him with wide, innocent eyes. I think it's time we find out what's inside, Jake said, his voice determined. And we're going to do it together. Mrs. Richardson looked at him, her face full of fear. Be careful, Jake. Once you open that box, there's no turning back. But Jake didn't listen. He couldn't afford to. He tore open the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled out the letter. It was old, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. He unfolded it slowly, scanning the words as they came into view. His heart dropped as he read. The letter wasn't just a warning. It was a message, a map, leading them to something buried deep within the town. Something that had been hidden for decades. Something that could change everything. Jake looked up at Mrs. Richardson and Emma. We need to go, he said, his voice steady. Now. The air was thick with tension as Jake and Emma followed the map from the letter. They had left the house under the cover of darkness, the cold night air biting at their skin. The streets of Cedar Ridge were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made Jake's instincts scream that something was wrong. He could feel the weight of the map in his pocket, the fragile paper crinkling with every step he took. He didn't know what they were going to find, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The letter had been clear. There was something buried in the town, something tied to his past. And now, it seemed like he couldn't escape it. Emma walked beside him, her small hand clutching his sleeve as they made their way to the old abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. It was an area Jake knew all too well, one he'd been to many times during his days with the Hells Angels. But he hadn't been back in years, and the place now seemed even darker, more foreboding. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Are you sure this is the right place? Emma asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. It's the only lead we've got. They reached the warehouse, its large metal doors rusted and covered in layers of grime. The windows were shattered, and the building seemed like it had been abandoned for decades. Yet, despite its desolation, Jake could feel the pulse of something alive inside it. Something dangerous. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the sound of creaking metal echoing in the still night. As they stepped inside, the smell of dust and old machinery hit them. The shadows seemed to swallow them whole as they ventured further into the building, the faint sound of their footsteps the only noise in the otherwise silent space. Emma shivered, her eyes wide as she looked around. What do you think is inside? she whispered. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the map from the letter. He spread it out on a nearby workbench, his fingers tracing the faded lines. The map wasn't detailed, just a few landmarks, a series of X's, and one name written in bold letters: the vault. Jake felt a cold chill run down his spine. He knew exactly what that meant. The vault was a secret place, hidden away for reasons that only a few knew. It was where the Hells Angels had kept their most dangerous secrets. And Jake was about to open that door. He folded the map carefully and put it back into his pocket. Turning to Emma, he gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Stay close," he said. "We don't know what we'll find in there." Emma nodded, her hand tightening around his sleeve. Together, they moved deeper into the warehouse, the floor beneath their feet creaking with every step. As they reached the back of the building, Jake saw it, the entrance to a hidden room, barely noticeable behind a stack of old crates. The door was locked, but Jake wasn't worried. He had the skills to open it, and his mind was focused on the task ahead. He pulled out a lockpick set from his jacket pocket and got to work, his fingers moving with precision. The sound of the lock clicking open seemed to echo through the warehouse, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. He pushed the door open, revealing a small room beyond. The air was musty, and the walls were lined with old shelves filled with dusty boxes and crates. But in the center of the room was something that caught his attention: a large metal safe. The safe was old, its surface scratched and dented from years of neglect. But Jake could see the remnants of a familiar logo, the Hells Angels insignia, engraved into the metal. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the secret. He walked toward the safe, Emma following close behind. The lock was intricate, but Jake had seen it before. It was a special type of lock used only by the club for their most sensitive materials. He didn't hesitate. His fingers worked quickly, and within moments, the lock clicked open. The safe door swung open with a groan, revealing its contents. Inside were stacks of old papers, files, and photographs, all carefully arranged. But at the very top was a single envelope, sealed with a wax stamp. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for it, his heart pounding in his chest. He tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the letter inside. The words were simple, but they hit him like a punch to the gut. The letter was from the leader of the Hells Angels, written years ago, before Jake had left the club. It spoke of a hidden treasure, a stash of money and documents that could change everything. And at the end of the letter was a single line that made Jake's blood run cold. "The vault is not just a place, it's a warning. Open it, and you'll unleash the storm." Jake stood frozen for a moment, the letter in his hands, the weight of its meaning sinking in. He looked at Emma, who was watching him with wide eyes, her face full of questions. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "This is just the beginning." He could feel it. The storm was coming, and they were right in its path. As Jake stood in the dimly lit room, the envelope in his hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The storm was coming, and he could feel it in the air, like an electric charge before the downpour. He glanced at Emma, who stood next to him, her small face pale with confusion and fear. She didn't understand all of it, but she could see the tension in his eyes. He could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what he had just uncovered. This wasn't just about some hidden treasure or long-forgotten secrets. It was a ticking time bomb, one that was about to explode. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice tight. "Now." He turned quickly, heading for the door, but as he reached for the handle, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of engines. Loud, powerful, unmistakable. It was the sound of motorcycles, and they were getting closer. Emma's eyes widened as she turned to look at him. "Jake, what's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer. He grabbed her hand, pulling her along as he hurried out of the room and into the main part of the warehouse. His heart was racing as he scanned the area. The bikes were closer now, their engines roaring in the distance. Jake didn't have to guess who they were. He had lived his life surrounded by the roar of engines, and he knew exactly what kind of riders were heading their way. The Hells Angels. They were here, and they were coming for him. Jake's mind raced as he looked around for an escape route. The back of the warehouse was blocked off, but the front doors were still open. The problem was, they'd never make it to the bike in time. He needed to think fast. "Get behind the crates," Jake whispered urgently, pushing Emma toward the large stack of wooden boxes near the back of the room. "Stay low and stay quiet." Emma nodded, her eyes wide with fear, and crouched behind the crates as Jake moved to the side, trying to stay out of sight. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, and soon the front of the warehouse was filled with the roar of the engines. Jake's muscles tensed, his hand resting on the knife at his side. He knew there was a good chance he wouldn't make it out of this. But he also knew that if he didn't do something, Emma wouldn't make it either. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. The first rider to enter the warehouse was a tall man with a thick beard and a patch over his left eye. His motorcycle was an imposing black chopper, the kind that screamed power and intimidation. Behind him, another rider entered, then another. Before Jake knew it, there were 5 bikers in the warehouse, each one dressed in the same leather jackets adorned with the Hells Angels insignia. They spread out across the room, their eyes scanning the area. "Jake Morrison," the man with the patch on his eye called out, his voice deep and menacing. "We know you're here. Come out and make this easy on yourself." Jake's grip tightened on the knife, but he stayed hidden. He knew the moment he stepped out, the fight would be over. They were too many, and they wouldn't hesitate to take him down. He had to buy time. "I don't want any trouble," Jake called out, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "But you're the ones who brought it here." The man with the patch on his eye chuckled darkly. "You think you can talk your way out of this, Jake? You've been running for a long time, but the past always catches up. And now, it's time to pay." Jake felt his stomach tighten. This was it. There was no running this time. The man took a step forward, his eyes scanning the shadows. "You know what we're looking for. The letter, the map, the vault. You've got it, and we want it." Jake didn't respond. He couldn't let them know that he had the letter, that he had found the map. If they knew, they'd kill him on the spot. He had to play this right. "You want the letter?" Jake said slowly, keeping his voice calm. "You're wasting your time. It's not worth anything to you." The man's expression hardened. "Don't lie to me, Jake. You know what's in that letter. And you know that if you don't hand it over, things are going to get worse for you." Jake knew the threat was real. He had seen enough violence in his life to know that these men weren't bluffing. They would do whatever it took to get what they wanted. But Jake wasn't going down without a fight. He couldn't. Not when Emma's life was on the line. "You want the letter?" Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll have to kill me first." The man grinned, his hand reaching for the gun holstered at his side. "Fine by me," he said. "We'll do this the hard way." In that instant, Jake's mind clicked into overdrive. He lunged from behind the crates, his knife flashing in the dim light of the warehouse. The first biker never saw it coming. Jake drove the blade into his side, taking him down in one swift motion. The other bikers reacted instantly, but Jake was already moving. He swung the knife, catching one biker across the arm, sending him stumbling backward. The fight had begun, but it wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for Emma's future, and Jake wasn't going to let these men take it from him. The rest of the bikers charged forward, but Jake was ready. He would fight until his last breath, no matter what it took. The warehouse was chaos. Jake moved swiftly, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he fought with everything he had. The biker he had taken down was still twitching on the ground, but the others were already regrouping, circling him. The noise of boots hitting the concrete echoed in the vast, empty space, blending with the sound of knives being drawn, the scrape of leather against metal, and the whir of machinery in the distance. Jake's heart raced as he sized up his opponents, each one a formidable foe. The man with the patch over his eye was the first to come at him, charging forward with a knife in hand. Jake was ready. He ducked and spun, his fist connecting with the man's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. But before Jake could strike again, another biker lunged at him, catching him off guard. The knife cut through his jacket, grazing his side, but Jake didn't flinch. His instincts kicked in, and he twisted the biker's arm, forcing him to drop the blade. The fight was becoming a blur of movement, Jake slashing, dodging, and countering. He could feel the sweat pouring down his back, his muscles burning with the strain. But he couldn't stop now. Not with Emma's safety on the line. He had to keep going. As the second biker went down, Jake spotted movement in his peripheral vision. He turned just in time to see the man with the scarred face drawing a gun from his waistband. The moment slowed. Jake's eyes locked onto the weapon, his heart thudding in his chest. This wasn't a fight he could win with brute force. He needed to outsmart them. Without thinking, he dove toward the nearest crate, knocking it over and using it as cover just as the first shot rang out. The bullet missed by inches, ricocheting off the metal behind him. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he crawled to the side, his mind racing. He needed to get Emma out of here. But there was no way she'd be safe as long as these bikers were after him. The man with the gun was now advancing, his eyes narrowed with intent. Jake didn't have much time. He needed a plan. He glanced around the warehouse, his gaze settling on a stack of metal pipes near the back. It was a long shot, but it was his only option. He slid out from behind the crate, making his move toward the pipes, hoping the bikers would be too focused on him to notice Emma. But the man with the gun was sharp. As soon as Jake stood up, another shot rang out, the bullet narrowly missing his shoulder. He winced, but kept moving. He dove behind the pile of pipes, his fingers brushing against the cold metal as he scrambled to find anything he could use as a weapon. His hand closed around a heavy wrench. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He gripped it tightly, his body tense as he prepared for the next move. The bikers were closing in. The one with the scarred face had reloaded and was now advancing with more caution, the gun raised. Jake knew he couldn't take another hit. He needed to end this. With a deep breath, he lunged from behind the pipes, swinging the wrench with all his strength. The impact sent the gun flying from the man's hand, and Jake followed up with a swift kick to the biker's chest, sending him crashing to the ground. But there was no time to rest. Jake's eyes darted around the room. The remaining bikers were regrouping, and they weren't backing down. Jake could hear the sounds of engines revving outside, more bikers arriving. The storm was coming, and it wasn't just the one inside the warehouse. He needed to get Emma and get out, fast. He turned and sprinted toward the back door, the wrench still gripped tightly in his hand. Behind him, the bikers were starting to move again, but he wasn't going to let them catch him. He pushed open the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear Emma's footsteps echoing as she ran toward him. She was right behind him, just as he had told her to be. They didn't stop. They couldn't. As they reached the street, Jake heard the roar of more engines, and when he looked back, he saw the bikers spilling out of the warehouse. There were too many of them. They were surrounded. "Keep running," Jake shouted to Emma. She didn't question him. She just ran, her small legs moving as fast as they could carry her. Jake's mind raced. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever, but maybe they didn't have to. They reached the alley at the end of the street, and Jake knew they had a choice. They could either keep running or make a stand. The alley was narrow, but it was a good place to fight if it came to that. He stopped, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her into the shadows of the alley. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and firm. Emma nodded, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't speak. She just hid behind a pile of old crates, her small body trembling. Jake could hear the bikers' voices now, louder and closer. There was no turning back. The storm was right on top of them, and Jake was ready to face it. He turned and pulled the wrench from his belt. He wasn't going down without a fight. Not this time. The alley was silent, save for the distant roar of engines and the sound of Jake's heartbeat hammering in his chest. He gripped the wrench tighter, his knuckles white from the pressure. The bikers were getting closer, their voices carrying through the cold air, taunting, demanding, and threatening. But Jake had made up his mind. This was where it ended. He would fight for Emma, and he would fight for the secret they had uncovered, no matter the cost. He turned toward her, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Stay hidden, Emma. Don't move unless I tell you to." Emma, her face pale and her body trembling, nodded, squeezing herself further into the shadows behind the crates. Jake could see her, though she was barely a silhouette in the darkness. He didn't know how much longer they could keep running, but he wouldn't let her down. His eyes flicked toward the street. The bikers were nearly there, and they weren't coming in quietly. Jake knew that they would come in full force, but he also knew that he couldn't let them get their hands on Emma. He would never forgive himself if something happened to her. He crouched low, listening as the bikers' motorcycles screeched closer, their wheels spinning on the wet pavement. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as the sounds grew louder. There were too many of them. His mind raced, but there were only a few options left. He could make a run for it with Emma, but that would be too risky. The alley was too narrow, and there were too many bikers. He needed a plan. Just as the first set of headlights appeared around the corner, Jake spotted something. A dumpster, tipped on its side, its contents spilling out into the street. Perfect. He darted to the left, crouching behind the pile of debris. The bikers, oblivious to his movements, roared past the alley entrance, their engines shaking the ground beneath Jake's feet. He peeked out from his hiding spot, watching them pass, and his breath caught in his throat. This was his chance. He turned to Emma, whispering urgently, "I'm going to draw them in. When I say go, you make a run for it. Stay low, and don't look back." Emma's eyes were wide with fear, but there was a glimmer of trust in them. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake took a deep breath and moved, his body moving in calculated silence as he edged toward the street. He could hear the bikers coming back. They had turned around, and they were looking for him. He needed to act fast. He grabbed a rusty pipe from the side of the dumpster and slammed it against the metal, creating a loud, clanging noise. The bikers' engines roared again, this time heading directly for him. As they neared the alley, Jake knew they would see him. He was ready. The first biker entered the alley, and Jake swung the pipe hard, striking him across the chest. The man went down with a grunt, his motorcycle tipping over with a crash. The others slammed on their brakes, skidding to a stop just feet away from Jake. "You think you can stop us, Jake?" one of them shouted, his voice dripping with contempt. "This ends now." Jake didn't respond. Instead, he lunged at the next biker, knocking him off his bike with a swift punch to the face. The third biker reached for his gun, but Jake was faster. He grabbed the gunman's arm, twisting it until the gun was wrenched from his grip and thrown across the alley. But the bikers were relentless. More appeared, their faces twisted with anger. Jake felt a sharp pain in his side. A knife had cut through his jacket. He gritted his teeth, trying to ignore it as he fought back, swinging the wrench at the nearest attacker. The fight had escalated quickly. Jake was outnumbered, but he didn't care. He had fought worse battles in his life. This was no different. He had Emma to protect, and nothing was going to stop him. He saw her then, emerging from the shadows, moving quickly toward the back of the alley, just like he had told her. His heart skipped a beat, and he knew it was time. "Go!" Jake shouted. Emma didn't hesitate. She darted toward the alley exit, her small frame disappearing into the night. Jake turned his attention back to the bikers, who were now more desperate. One of them reached for his knife, but Jake was ready. He swung the wrench, knocking the knife from his hand and sending the man staggering backward. But more bikers were coming. Jake couldn't keep them all back. He knew he had to get to Emma, to make sure she was safe. He backed up, inch by inch, making sure the bikers couldn't get any closer. As he turned to flee, another biker lunged at him, his fist connecting with Jake's jaw. Jake staggered back, but he kept his feet, adrenaline keeping him on his feet as he fought to stay upright. He could see Emma in the distance now, running down the street toward the safety of the next block. The bikers were closing in, but he wasn't about to let them get to her. Jake pushed forward, throwing one last punch at the biker in front of him, sending him crashing to the ground. He turned and ran, as fast as his legs could carry him. Every step brought him closer to Emma, closer to safety. The sound of motorcycles revving up again followed him, but Jake didn't look back. He knew they couldn't catch him, not now, not when he had Emma. He reached her just as she rounded the corner. "Let's go," he said, grabbing her hand. Together, they ran, disappearing into the night, leaving the bikers behind. The storm hadn't passed yet, but they were free, for now. They ran for what felt like miles, the sounds of motorcycles fading into the night behind them. Jake's chest burned as he pushed forward, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He kept his grip on Emma's hand tight, pulling her along as they darted through alleyways and side streets, looking for any place to hide. His mind was racing. He had to think of something. They couldn't keep running forever. The letter, the vault, the bikers, it was all too much. But Emma's safety was the only thing that mattered right now. The streets were empty. The town eerily quiet in the early hours of the morning. Jake could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each breath a reminder of how close they had come to being caught. He couldn't let that happen. Not after everything they had been through. They finally slowed as they reached an old, run-down house on the outskirts of town. It was abandoned, the windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. "Perfect." Jake turned to Emma, his voice low but urgent. "We're going inside. Stay quiet, stay close." Emma nodded, her wide eyes scanning their surroundings. She looked scared, but she trusted him. And that was all he needed right now. They made their way to the back of the house, slipping inside through a broken door. The air inside was musty, the floors creaking underfoot as they moved through the dimly lit interior. Jake's eyes adjusted to the dark, his instincts kicking in as he surveyed the space. It wasn't much, just an old living room with a few pieces of broken furniture. But it would do for now. He led Emma to a corner of the room, out of sight from the door. "We'll stay here for a bit," he said, his voice soft. Emma sat down on the floor, her legs pulled up to her chest as she hugged her knees. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, though he wasn't so sure. He had a feeling the bikers weren't going to let up. And as much as he hated to admit it, he didn't know how much longer they could keep running. "For now," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He took a deep breath and pulled the letter from his jacket, the one they had found in the warehouse. He unfolded it slowly, the paper crinkling with age. The words were clear, but their meaning was still a mystery. Jake scanned the letter again, his eyes narrowing as he tried to piece it together. "The vault is not just a place, it's a warning. Open it, and you'll unleash the storm." The words echoed in his mind, over and over. What did it all mean? What storm? He needed answers, and fast. But there was no one left to trust. The Hell's Angels were after them, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let them hurt Emma. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable. Someone was outside. He motioned for Emma to stay quiet, his body tensing as he stood up. He crept to the door, peering out through the cracked window. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the shadows moving in the distance. They weren't alone. More bikers. Jake's mind raced. They had to get out of here. He turned to Emma, his face serious. "Stay here. I'll go check it out." Emma shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, Jake. Don't leave me." Jake felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He wanted to tell her everything would be fine, that they would make it through this. But he couldn't lie to her. He couldn't make promises he couldn't keep. "I'll be right back," he said softly. He gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes, before slipping out the back door. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He moved quietly, staying low to the ground as he crept toward the front of the house. The shadows were thick, but Jake's eyes had adjusted to the dark. He could see the bikers now, gathered outside, their motorcycles lined up along the street. They were talking in low voices, but Jake could hear snippets of their conversation. He can't get away this time. He's got the letter. He knows too much. Jake's blood ran cold. They were talking about him. About the letter. He didn't have much time. He backed away from the window, his mind racing as he thought of a plan. He needed to draw them away from the house. He had to get them off their trail. He could hear the engines revving, the sound of bikes starting up. The bikers were leaving. Jake didn't wait another second. He sprinted back toward the back door, slipping inside as quietly as possible. Emma was still sitting in the corner, her face pale but determined. "They're leaving," Jake said, his voice low. "We need to move fast." Emma stood up immediately, her fear replaced with resolve. She trusted him, and that was all that mattered. They had no more time to waste. Jake grabbed her hand, leading her toward the back of the house. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." They slipped out of the house, moving quickly through the yard and into the nearby woods. Jake's heart raced as they ran, every step bringing them closer to freedom. But the storm wasn't over yet. The bikers would be back, and this time, they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Jake had made his choice. He would protect Emma, no matter the cost. And he would fight until the end. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back. The night was heavy with the weight of silence as Jake and Emma continued to run through the dense woods, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. The moon barely illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows between the trees. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made Jake tense, his eyes darting around, scanning for movement. The sound of motorcycles from earlier still echoed in his ears, a reminder of how close they were to being caught. He pulled Emma along, his grip tight around her hand, but he was trying to stay calm. She was breathing heavily beside him, but she didn't complain. She just kept running, her small feet quick and determined. Jake felt a surge of guilt. He had promised her safety, but they were far from safe now. The bikers were still out there, and they were bound to come looking for them. The storm hadn't passed, not by a long shot. Jake's mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, But his thoughts kept returning to the letter they had found, the map, the vault, the warning. He had to figure out what it all meant, but there was no time for that now. They needed to stay ahead of the bikers. He glanced over at Emma. Her face was set in a determined expression, though there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. Jake could see it, but he didn't say anything. She didn't need more fear. She needed him to be strong, even when he wasn't sure if he could be. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, not slowing their pace. Emma nodded quickly, though she didn't say anything. Jake squeezed her hand tighter, reassuring her with his presence. They continued to run, weaving through the trees, ducking low to avoid the branches. They moved like shadows in the dark, the only sound their breath and the crunch of the leaves underfoot. It felt like hours before they finally slowed, both of them gasping for air. Jake motioned for Emma to crouch down behind a thick bush. They had reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin out. From here, Jake could see the faint outline of a small town ahead, the lights of distant houses just visible. But the town was too close to the bikers' territory. If they tried to make it there, they'd be caught. They needed to find shelter, a place to regroup. Jake's mind was still racing, but he forced himself to focus. "We can't go into town," Jake whispered, his voice low but firm. "We need to find somewhere else, somewhere safe." Emma's face was pale, but she nodded in understanding. She didn't question him. They both knew they had to keep moving. Jake glanced around, searching for a way forward. Through the trees, he saw a small structure ahead, an old barn, half hidden behind some overgrown bushes and trees. It looked abandoned, but that was exactly what they needed. They couldn't risk heading toward civilization, not yet. They moved cautiously toward the barn, staying low and careful to avoid making any noise. When they reached the door, Jake gently tried to push it open. The hinges squealed in protest, but the door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside. The barn was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of old hay and wood. Jake paused, listening for any sounds of pursuit, but there was nothing. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing heavily, their senses alert. Emma was shaking slightly, but she didn't speak. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, but she was holding it together. He was proud of her. "We'll rest here for a bit," Jake said quietly, trying to reassure her. "We need to figure out our next move." He led her to a corner of the barn where a few old crates were stacked, their surfaces covered in dust. They sat down on the crates, and Jake pulled the letter from his jacket. He looked at it again, trying to make sense of the words, the warning, the map. There had to be something they were missing. As Jake studied the letter, he noticed something. There was a faint ink stain on the edge of the paper, like it had been blotted there by accident. He leaned in closer, tracing the stain with his finger. It wasn't just any ink stain. It looked like part of a map. The ink blot had created a pattern that wasn't random. It was a set of coordinates, a place marked far from here. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The clue they had been looking for. He knew the location. It was a remote area, a place even the bikers didn't frequent. He didn't know why the letter had been left for him, but he knew it was important. And he knew they had to go there. "Emma," Jake said, his voice firm. "We have to go to these coordinates. It's the only way to end this." Emma looked up at him, her face serious but trusting. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked. Jake nodded. "It will be. It has to be." He stood up, offering his hand to Emma. She took it without hesitation. Together, they left the barn and headed toward the road that would take them to the coordinates. They weren't just running anymore. They were heading straight into the heart of the storm, but Jake knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Emma, not while he still had breath in his body. And this time, they were going to uncover the truth, whatever it took. The air was heavy with tension as Jake and Emma made their way through the dense woods. Every step felt like an eternity, each breath a reminder of how close they were to being caught. The map, now tucked safely in Jake's jacket, felt like it weighed more than ever. The coordinates it led to were a mystery, but Jake had a gut feeling they were headed in the right direction. There was no turning back now. They had to keep moving. Emma walked silently beside him, her small hand gripped tightly in his. Jake could feel the fear in her, but she didn't complain. She just kept moving, her eyes scanning the surroundings as they traveled deeper into the forest. Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of guilt. He had promised her safety, but the bikers were still out there, still hunting them. Every shadow in the trees, every creak of the branches, made him tense. They couldn't outrun them forever. They needed a plan, but Jake didn't have time to think. He had to stay focused. "We're almost there," he whispered to Emma, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. The woods were getting thicker, and the path was becoming less defined. But Jake knew the area well enough to trust his instincts. He had spent years riding through these parts, familiar with the trails, the old roads, the hidden places where no one could find him. He just hoped it would be enough to stay ahead of the Hells Angels. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally reached a clearing. In the distance, Jake could see the faint outline of a small cabin. It was old, its wooden exterior weathered by years of neglect, but it looked like the perfect place to rest and regroup. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the cabin. Something about it felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a sense of danger that lingered in the air. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. Emma nodded, though she looked as uncertain as he felt. They approached the cabin cautiously, stepping softly across the clearing. Jake's senses were on high alert as they reached the door. He reached for the handle, his heart pounding in his chest, but as soon as his fingers brushed against it, the door creaked open on its own. Jake froze, his eyes darting to the shadows around them. Was it just the wind, or was someone waiting inside? He didn't have time to think. He pulled Emma behind him and stepped inside, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his side. The cabin was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they moved further into the room. Jake's eyes adjusted to the low light, and he could make out the shapes of old furniture, long abandoned. There was a fireplace in the corner, a few chairs scattered around a wooden table, and a worn-out rug in the center of the floor. Nothing seemed to be out of place, but Jake's instincts told him to be careful. He moved cautiously toward the center of the room, his eyes scanning every corner. "Hello," he called. "Out," his voice steady but wary. The silence was deafening. There was no response. Jake's grip tightened on the knife, his body tense, ready for whatever was coming. But nothing happened. After a long pause, Jake let out a slow breath, lowering the knife. It was clear the cabin was empty. Still, he didn't trust it. He moved further inside, checking the rooms one by one. The first room was a small bedroom, its bed long abandoned, the sheets tattered and worn. The second room was a kitchen, with a rusted stove and cabinets that were falling apart. But in the back corner of the kitchen, something caught his eye, a small trapdoor, barely visible under the pile of debris. Jake's curiosity flared. What was hidden beneath? He motioned for Emma to stay behind him, then knelt down to open the trapdoor. The hinges groaned as he pulled it up, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Stay here," he told Emma, his voice firm. She nodded, but didn't look happy about it. Jake descended the stairs, his heart pounding as he moved deeper into the darkness. The air was damp, the smell of earth and mildew filling his nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, he found another door, this one old and worn, its edges cracked and splintered. He didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open, the sound of it creaking echoing in the silence. What he found on the other side stopped him cold. The room was filled with old boxes, some of them sealed with thick, old rope, others stacked haphazardly in the corner. But in the center of the room was a large, wooden chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The chest was locked, the iron clasp rusted with age. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he stepped closer. Could this be it? Could this be what the letter had been leading him to? The storm, the bikers, the vault, it all pointed to this moment. He reached for the lock, his fingers trembling as he tried to pry it open. It took a moment, but eventually, the lock gave way with a sharp snap. The lid creaked open, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. Inside the chest was a pile of old papers, bound together with thick twine. But that wasn't what made Jake's blood run cold. At the very top of the stack was a photograph, one he recognized instantly. It was a picture of him, taken years ago, when he was still in the Hells Angels. But it wasn't just any photo. In the background, standing beside him, was someone he thought he'd never see again. His father. Jake's hands shook as he pulled the photograph free, his mind racing. What was going on? Why was his father's image in this chest, tied to everything that was happening now? The answers were just out of reach, but Jake knew one thing for sure. The storm was far from over. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he held the photograph in his hands. The familiar face of his father stared back at him, frozen in time, and for the first time in years, Jake felt the weight of the past come crashing down on him. His father had been a legend in the Hells Angels, a man whose shadow Jake had lived under for most of his life. But his father had also been a man of secrets, and it seemed that those secrets were coming back to haunt him. He quickly scanned the rest of the contents of the chest. Along with the photograph, there were stacks of old documents, all bound together with twine. The papers were yellowed with age, and the ink was faded, but Jake could make out a few words here and there. They seemed to reference the Hells Angels, the money, and a deal that had been made years ago. It was all connected. He knew it. The storm, the bikers, the vault, it all came back to this moment. But what was his father's role in it all? Why had he kept this chest hidden away? Jake's mind raced, but there was no time to sit and ponder. The sound of motorcycles grew louder in the distance, and he knew the bikers were closing in. He had to move. He stuffed the photograph and documents into his jacket, locking the chest again and pushing it back into its place. He took one last look around the room, making sure nothing had been left behind. His eyes lingered on the trapdoor, the same one that had led him to this discovery. It felt like the whole room was closing in on him, like everything he had fought for was slipping through his fingers. But he didn't have the luxury of time. He had to get Emma, and he had to get out. Fast. Jake turned and headed back up the stairs, his steps light but hurried. As he emerged into the cabin, he saw Emma sitting in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. She had stayed exactly where he told her to, but Jake could tell she was scared. She had every reason to be. He walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "We have to go," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "The bikers are getting closer." Emma stood up without hesitation, her small body trembling, but she didn't say a word. She trusted him. Jake grabbed her hand, leading her toward the door. The cabin was now a death trap, and they couldn't afford to stay any longer. He scanned the area outside, his senses on high alert. The bikers had to be close. He could feel it. They stepped into the woods again, the cold night air biting at their skin. Jake's heart raced as they moved deeper into the trees, away from the cabin. His mind was still focused on the photograph, the documents, the secrets of his father's past. But the danger was real. They couldn't outrun the bikers forever. Jake's steps quickened, pulling Emma along as fast as he could. But the woods weren't the safe haven he'd hoped for. The sounds of engines grew louder, and Jake's grip on Emma's hand tightened. He could hear the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles behind them. They weren't far off. He turned to Emma, his face grim. "Run," he whispered. "Don't stop." Without waiting for a response, he pushed Emma ahead of him, urging her to go faster. She ran, her legs moving quickly, but Jake knew they couldn't outrun them. The bikers were too close. He looked around frantically, searching for a way out. His eyes landed on an old shack in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was better than being out in the open. "This way," Jake said, his voice urgent. They ran toward the shack, the sound of the bikes growing closer. As they reached the door, Jake swung it open, and they hurried inside, slamming it shut behind them. The shack was dark and musty, the air thick with dust and decay. But it would have to do. Jake pushed Emma behind a stack of old crates, and he crouched low, his body tense. They had to stay quiet. He could hear the bikers' motorcycles now, their engines roaring as they pulled into the clearing. Jake's breath caught in his throat. They were right outside. He stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. Emma's small hand reached out to him, and he squeezed it, trying to reassure her. But even he wasn't sure how much longer they could stay hidden. The sound of boots crunching on the ground outside made Jake's pulse race. He couldn't tell how many bikers there were, but the noise told him it was more than just a few. He held his breath, listening as the bikers dismounted, their footsteps heavy as they circled the shack. He knew they wouldn't give up easily. They were close. Too close. He could hear one of them speaking in low tones, their words muffled by the walls of the shack. "They're here somewhere," the voice said, low and gruff. "I can feel it." Jake's heart skipped a beat. They weren't just searching. They were hunting. He turned to Emma, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he wasn't going to let them get to her. He wasn't going to let them get to him either. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but nothing came to him. The bikers were getting closer, and they would find the shack eventually. He needed a distraction, something to throw them off. His eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that could help. Then, his gaze landed on the old stove in the corner of the shack. It was rusted and falling apart, but it had a large metal pipe running along the wall, connecting it to the outside. A plan began to form in Jake's mind. It was risky, but it was their only shot. He motioned for Emma to stay still as he slowly moved toward the stove. He had to time this perfectly. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Jake knew they were almost at the door. He took a deep breath, then swung the stove door open. He grabbed a piece of metal from inside and threw it across the room, the sound echoing in the quiet space. The noise was enough. The bikers outside heard it and immediately rushed toward the back of the shack. Jake and Emma had seconds before they came back. Without a word, Jake grabbed her hand again and pulled her toward the back door, slipping into the night just as the bikers turned the corner. They had a small window of opportunity. They had to run, and they had to run fast. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like they might give out, the darkness pressing in from all sides as the sound of engines returned, louder now, closer, angrier. Jake knew the bikers had learned their pattern. They were not searching blindly anymore. They were hurting. The woods thinned ahead, opening into an old service road that Jake remembered from years back, a forgotten stretch that once led to a quarry no one used anymore. His mind locked onto it as their only chance. He pulled Emma close, lowering his voice to a whisper filled with urgency. "We are almost out of time. When we reach the road, you do exactly what I say, no matter what you hear." Emma nodded, her face pale but steady, the kind of courage that comes from trust rather than fearlessness. As they burst onto the road, the night exploded with sound. Motorcycle engines roared from both directions, headlights cutting through the darkness like blades. Jake's heart slammed in his chest. They were surrounded. The countdown had begun. He could feel it in every breath, every second ticking away in his head. He grabbed Emma and pulled her behind a concrete drainage culvert near the edge of the road, its rough surface cold against their backs. The ground vibrated as bikes skidded to a stop nearby. Voices echoed through the night, sharp and confident. They knew they had won. Jake closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing his racing thoughts into focus. The letter, the documents, the photograph of his father. This was what it had all been leading to. Not the vault, not the money, but leverage. The truth his father had buried to protect people who did not deserve protection. Jake reached into his jacket and felt the folded papers, still there. Proof. Enough to destroy the leadership that now hunted them. He leaned close to Emma, his voice barely audible. "When I run, you stay here until the engines move. Away. Then you follow the creek downstream. There is a ranger station less than a mile away. You keep moving until you see lights." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "No." Jake swallowed hard. "This is not a choice. You are the reason I cannot lose tonight." The bikers stepped closer, boots crunching on gravel. A familiar voice cut through the noise, calm and cruel. "Jake Morrison. Time is up. Hand it over," and the kid walks away. Jake stood slowly, stepping out from behind the culvert before Emma could stop him. He raised his hands, his body aching, his mind clear. "You want it. I know. But you do not get to decide how this ends." The leader laughed, a short sound without humor. "You always were your father's son." Jake felt the words hit harder than any punch. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the documents, holding them up so the headlights caught the pages. "This ends when everyone sees what you buried." The room went still, the kind of stillness that comes right before disaster. The leader's smile vanished. "You would not dare." Jake looked back toward Emma, hiding behind the culvert, and then back to the men who had ruled his life with fear for too long. "I already did." He threw the papers into the air, the wind carrying them across the road, pages scattering into the darkness. Shouts erupted. Engines revved. Chaos broke loose as bikers scrambled, some chasing the flying documents, others lunging toward Jake. That was the moment. Jake turned and ran straight at the nearest bike, slamming into it with everything he had. The impact sent him rolling across the gravel, pain exploding through his body, but he forced himself up, shouting as loud as he could. "Run, Emma. Now." The engines surged away, riders splitting in different directions, panic replacing control as they tried to recover the truth slipping through their fingers. Emma waited only a heartbeat, then bolted, just as Jake had taught her, her small form disappearing into the darkness along the creek. Jake staggered, his vision swimming, but a sense of calm settled over him. The countdown was over. Whatever happened next, he had changed the rules. Sirens sounded in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder, carried by the night air. Someone had called it in. Maybe fate. Maybe his father, finally keeping his promise from beyond the grave. Jake sank to his knees as headlights swept past him, not bikes this time, but patrol vehicles. He smiled through the pain, knowing Emma was running towards safety, knowing the secret should have stayed buried, but now it never would. The storm had broken, and for the first time in his life, Jake Morrison was ready to face the aftermath. The sirens were getting closer, the sound growing louder as the flashing lights cut through the night. Jake remained crouched in the shadows, his body aching from the fight, his breath ragged from the adrenaline, but his mind was calm. He had done what he came to do. The bikers had been thrown into chaos, and the truth was no longer buried. As he watched Emma disappear into the distance, heading towards safety, a sense of relief washed over him. He couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in a long while, they had a chance. The storm might have been far from over, but the worst of it had passed. Jake had to believe that. But as the patrol cars arrived and the chaos in the clearing slowly began to calm, Jake realized that even though the bikers were scattering, even though the truth was exposed, nothing would be the same. He would never be the man he was before. He wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing yet, but he knew it was the only way forward. He stood slowly, wincing as the pain in his side flared up. His hand instinctively went to the spot where the knife had grazed him, but he didn't have time to focus on the injury. He had a responsibility now. He had a promise to keep. He looked back at the trail Emma had run down, the shadows swallowing her up as she sprinted toward the safety of the ranger station. He had to catch up with her, make sure she was all right. But first, he had to make sure the bikers wouldn't follow. He turned to face the clearing, his body moving with a grim determination. He was done running. He would not let the past come back to haunt him again, not after everything they had fought through. He moved toward the edge of the road, knowing the bikers would be coming back too. Regroup. The last thing Jake needed was for them to find Emma alone. He had to create enough of a distraction to give her the time she needed to get to safety. He reached into his jacket pocket, feeling the weight of the letter and the documents he had stolen from the bikers. It wasn't much, but it was the leverage he needed. Jake moved quickly, pulling a few items from the truck he had hidden in the nearby woods, and began setting up his plan. He could hear the motorcycles in the distance, but they weren't close enough yet. He still had a few minutes. He worked quickly, setting a small trail of oil along the edge of the road, then grabbing a match from his pocket. With one final glance toward the road, he struck the match and tossed it into the oil. A small fire flared up, quickly catching the trail he had set. The flames were small, but they would be enough to draw the bikers' attention. Just as he finished, he heard the roar of motorcycles approaching. He knew it wouldn't be long before they saw the fire. It was a simple plan, but it would do the trick. Jake ducked into the shadows, keeping himself out of sight as the bikers neared the clearing. The first of the motorcycles came into view, and when the lead rider saw the fire, his eyes widened in confusion. It worked. The bikers slowed, trying to make sense of what was happening. Jake stayed hidden, his breath steady, waiting for them to get close enough. As the bikers stopped, looking at the fire and talking in low voices, Jake made his move. He ran toward the woods, taking the long route around the clearing. He wasn't going to risk getting caught in the open. His legs burned as he moved through the trees, his focus narrowing on one thing: getting to Emma. She was too far ahead now, but he could still catch up. The bikers wouldn't be able to follow him through the woods. The fire had done its job. He could hear the motorcycles revving again as they started to move, the riders distracted by the blaze. Jake pushed himself harder, forcing his tired body to keep running. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burning wood, but Jake didn't stop. Not until he saw the distant glow of the ranger station lights through the trees. He kept his eyes focused on the road ahead, praying he wouldn't be too late. He wasn't sure how long it took him to reach the ranger station, but when he finally arrived, he found Emma sitting on the steps, her face pale but relieved. She looked up when she saw him, her expression softening. "You're okay?" she whispered. Jake nodded, his heart still racing. "We're safe for now." They both knew the storm wasn't over. But for the first time, Jake believed they could survive it. Together, he sat down beside Emma, looking out at the dark road they had just come down. The distant sound of sirens still echoed in the air, but for the moment, They were safe. Emma leaned against him, her small body trembling slightly. Jake wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We're not done yet," he said softly. "But we've made it this far." Emma nodded, her face filled with quiet strength. She didn't need to say anything. They both knew the truth. They had a long road ahead of them, but they would face it together. And no matter what came next, Jake knew they would keep running, keep fighting, until they found the peace they were searching for.